All right, joining us next on the show today, this big Friday edition of Steak for Breakfast. He's a retired U.S. Army colonel and government official, author, consultant, commentator, especially when he's here on Steak for Breakfast. Douglas Macgregor, thanks for joining us on the show.
Oh, thank you.
Colonel, how's everything going on your end? It's been kind of busy times geopolitically. We've seen Ukraine has failed at their, I'm losing count now, fourth or fifth counter spring-summer offensive. You want to give us the latest on what you're hearing out of there?
Yeah, I think the latest is important because not too many Americans are getting the truth. I was surprised the other day the Daily Telegraph over in Great Britain published an article that for once was quite truthful and pointed out that the West is now staring at what they termed catastrophic defeat in Ukraine. And they went on to explain that, the Ukrainians have lost within the first month now more than 26,000 dead, thousands of wounded, along with 1,100 different pieces of equipment, tanks, armored fighting vehicles, trucks, you name it. They've also lost, as a result of deep strikes by the Russians, large ammunition storage depots, food, you name it. The Russians last night and the night before have annihilated many of the grain storage areas in and around Odessa. And this, of course, is because they finally decided to shut the port down because the Ukrainians were bringing ships in that were largely empty to pick up grain. Only they weren't empty. They were bringing in arms and ammunition. So the Russians said, enough's enough, no more nonsense. And this is going to drive up the price of grain, obviously, largely for Europe, but not exclusively, because Ukrainians are going to have to export entirely overland into Poland and up to the Baltic. And there are problems with that because many European producers don't want their market flooded with cheap Ukrainian products, whether it's sow bellies or grain or anything else. But the point is that the war is taking a very nasty turn now. And I really think that Ukrainians are facing disintegration. Their army is in terrible condition. I just published an op-ed that included an excerpt from a report that was released in Kiev that talks about the mass desertions that are occurring now on the battlefield. Units are giving up because they can't even evacuate their wounded. And when a commander can't evacuate his wounded, he has a choice. He can sort of sit there and watch all of them die because he can't really move his force, or he can surrender. And many of them have said, look, I'm not going to stand around and watch all these people die for nothing. So they've surrendered to the Russians. And the Russians, of course, have been smart. They've always treated surrendering Ukrainian troops very, very well. They don't abuse them. They feed them, clothe them, send them to decent facilities where they can be kept until a prisoner exchange occurs. And so people are not afraid to surrender to the Russians. So I think the whole thing is disintegrating. And I think that's one of the reasons you saw Zelensky treated as a sort of the redheaded stepchild at the Vilnius summit.
Sure. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was really interesting to see the way he was almost publicly shunned by all the people who have been, stuffing his pockets for the last 2 years now. And it seemed like a lot of the major world leaders that attended the NATO summit got out ahead early, talking about how they weren't going to be admitted to. I mean, Lloyd Austin almost joked about it, like, can't admit them to NATO now. It would trigger a war. That guy has no idea what he's doing, but, at least for his memorized talking points for the focus groups, he was ready with the correct answer there.
Do you think Zelensky was being shunned because he wasn't adhering to the dress code again?
That's true. He did.
Well, he's always in costume, presenting himself as this battlefield commander, which, of course, is a joke. But, the larger problem is this, and this is what Americans don't seem to understand. Hundreds of thousands of people have been killed.
Sure.
Overwhelmingly Ukrainian soldiers and civilians. We think between 350,000 Ukrainian soldiers are dead. You say that, and the Western media says, oh, no, that's not true, but the Russians have lost that many. Well, that's absurd. The Russians have taken very light casualties. There is no battle of attrition with who's going to lose the most first. That's already happened. Ukraine has been attrited. Mm-hmm. The tragedy here is that it needs to end because it's not going to get any better. The problem has always been the same. How do you build an army, let alone an armed force, on the fly? I mean, the Ukrainian army that existed at the outset was a little over 400,000, and that include reserves. Most of those men are either dead or wounded.
Yeah.
And so then you have to fall back on new armies. Well, new armies don't rise up quickly. They need institutions. They have to have leadership. They have to have training and organization. They have to have a systematic equipping program. You don't build an army out of a hodgepodge of equipment from 15 different countries. It's just nonsense. So this whole project is collapsing, and we're now at the point of desperation. And what we're doing in the meantime is lying, trying to convince everybody in sight something's real that isn't. That is that the Ukrainian state is real. No, it's dying. The Ukrainian nation is at risk of going out of existence. No one has the courage to stand up in Washington or London and tell the truth. This must end. Yeah, if for no other reasons, on the grounds of, humanitarian concern. And of course, then you have Europeans in Poland and Slovakia and Hungary and many other countries in Germany who are saying, we've got to end this thing and get these Ukrainians to go home, because virtually every Ukrainian that comes out says, I'm never going back.
Right.
Why would I go back to this hopelessly corrupt gangster state, where I can be further exploited? And then we don't even talk about the estimated 60,000 children that have disappeared from the planet coming out of Ukraine. And if anybody's seen the movie Sound of Freedom, it doesn't take a genius to figure out what's happening to these poor children.
Yeah.
It's just unthinkable, to say the least. And yes, I definitely agree with you. There's that component there. It's like the unspoken words that, only the reals will talk about, like yourself, Colonel. And then, when you see the way other stuff is kind of unfolding right now, there's been a couple other weird components of this. There was like the fake coup, and now the Wagner Group is kind of set up in Belarus. What do you think is the issue with that? And then, you mentioned Vladimir Putin a couple of times. He's really been posturing and saber rattling, especially the last 24 hours. He had a meeting with all of his government officials yesterday where he was talking about, Poland, maybe they shouldn't have some of the land that was gifted to them back in the day from Russia, and then started talking about how in years past, they did things to help break up different parts of Europe that they thought were historically and geographically not appropriate, like the Czech Republic and stuff like that. What do you think about those two things?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, the Wagner Group, one of the reasons for Prigozhin's behavior was to save the Wagner organization from destruction. Gerasimov, the chief of staff, and Shoigu, the minister of defense, had been doing everything in their power to effectively liquidate Wagner. They're sick to death of Prigozhin. I don't think they appreciated some of the things that he said publicly, even though many of them were true. So he appealed directly to President Putin and said, don't just liquidate us. We've done a good job. We're Russian patriots. And of course, inside Russia, Prigozhin and his fighters are enormously popular people. I mean, they're seen as Russian heroes who fought and bested, the Ukrainians at every turn, even at the great cost to themselves. So that's one thing. The second thing is that he was trying to get a message to Putin, and that is, look, these damn generals that you've got in charge are wasting time and wasting lives. We need to get this war over with. The Ukrainians are finished. Let's attack and end it. And I think that's what you're seeing now. You talk about meetings and saber rattling. I think the Russians now know that this thing called Ukraine is falling apart. This Zelensky government is a facade. The corruption, the incompetence, the squandering of resources, and worst of all, the squandering of human life in defense of what is really a sick, perverse regime in Kyiv have all caught up, and the Russians are beginning to say, let's get on with this. And at the same time, remember, they've got an offensive underway.
Yep.
It runs from the Russian border just opposite Belgrade all the way up to Liman and Slovyansk. And now there are a number of different ways that they can go. But there are two things to remember. First of all, they're meeting some tough resistance around Slovyansk, but practically nowhere else. And the Russians are moving very deliberately because, again, they don't want to take unnecessary casualties. And they're happy when the Ukrainians surrender because they're not really interested in killing more Ukrainians. I mean, these are Slavic Orthodox Christians, much like themselves. Why do they want to kill them? This is something that eludes us here in the West. We don't get it. The other thing is that they're not far from Kharkov, which is historically a Russian city. And like Odessa, it's been designated as one of those two major cities that the Russians will retake. So I anticipate that as they move their integrated air defenses forward, which eliminates any air threat and missile threat, and then secondly, as they adjust their strike systems linked to their overhead surveillance so that they can move everything forward and effectively blast out of existence anything that shows up in great numbers. As that happens, you're going to see them move further and further north and west. And eventually, I think you'll see them encircle Kharkov. I'd be surprised if that doesn't happen in August. And when it does, then I think the Russians will sit around Kharkov and wait for the last reserves of the Ukrainian military to attack them. And they'll annihilate them the way they've annihilated them in front of their defenses in southern Ukraine. And again, what do the Russians want? They want Ukraine, whatever remains of it, to be neutral. That's it. That's what they want. They don't want any foreign forces in it. They don't want NATO to have anything to do with it. That's it. If we'll accept that, we're on our way to a resolution of the conflict. And then secondly, they want all foreign forces, especially U.S., that are there, out of Ukraine. They want a suspension of the aid. Now, you do those three things, the Russians will show up within hours. You can have peace talks, and you're going to end up with some sort of arrangement. Many people in the West aren't going to like it because it's going to have to recognize de facto what the Russians hold, they keep. We need to end this war.
Colonel, why is it so hard for the entirety of everyone that's involved with the government, the military-industrial complex, geopolitically, and all the offices of the embassies connected to the United States to go out and say the one thing that one man has said pretty much since this conflict started? It didn't need to happen, and it can end immediately, like you've also suggested. That's President Trump, who's kind of running away with the GOP nomination right now. He should be the nominee, unless some existential factors that we can't even fathom come into play here. And likely will be able to take back the White House in 2024. If that happens, do you think Donald Trump's long-standing relationship with Vladimir Putin and how they worked together to kind of keep themselves apart, if you know what I mean, combined with how Donald Trump kind of put his foot down for Zelensky in Ukraine, it seems like the rest of the world is already there with him right now after the last NATO summit, can resolve this relatively quickly?
If Donald Trump sends a note to President Putin along the lines of what I just described, yes. But I think Donald Trump has a habit, and look, I'm a Trump supporter. There's nobody else out there. Let's be honest. There's no one else who can lead the nation out of the abyss that it is in at the moment but Donald Trump. Now, I also think very highly of Bobby Kennedy. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is, God bless him, a real Democrat. He's not a Marxist, anarchist nutcase, which is generally what we have on the left.
Right.
He's the real thing, which, of course, is why the left hates him. All you have to do is watch how he was treated in front of the House committee within the last couple of days and see how these Democrats attacked him relentlessly. If you look at those two men and you look at the support they command, I would say that, Donald Trump should win the next election. The problem with that is election integrity.
Right.
And we don't need to spend a lot of time on it, but there's no reason to believe that the next round of elections will be any better or any more honest than what we've experienced in the past. This whole absentee ballot business is an opportunity for fraud. The mail-in ballot nonsense is fraud. I got a call from a friend in Las Vegas. This was on election day in 2020. And he was standing in the lobby of a big fancy hotel in Vegas. And he said, the absentee ballots are all over the lobby. All you have to do is pick one up, fill it out, and shove it into the box. Come on, who are we kidding? That whole thing was a fraud. So if you can deal with that, then I think everything should work out. The problem is I don't know that we're really going to deal with that. That's the first thing. Second thing is, and I love Donald Trump, but he places too much emphasis on personal relationships.
Right.
The relations between great powers, great states, have very little to do with human relationships. If people that hate each other can come to agreements, provided the interests justify those agreements. Right now, we and the Russians, as Donald Trump pointed out repeatedly, have no reason to go to war. We have no serious differences that would justify armed conflict. That's the stupidity of this entire enterprise. The Russians have vital strategic interests in Ukraine. We have vital strategic interests in Mexico. For us to insist that Russia go along with the transformation of Ukraine into a giant weapon aimed at Russia by us is insane. We would not tolerate that if that were the case in Mexico. Mm-hmm. So there has to be some understanding. I think Donald Trump understands that very well. I think Robert Kennedy does as well. So the interests to end this thing are real. That can work, but we got to be very careful of this. Well, I have a great relationship with so-and-so. It may not make any damn difference if you follow my logic. The reasons for this to end, for us to get along, are enormously powerful interests. So we don't need to have, treat each other as friends of the family. FDR called Stalin Uncle Joe. Well, Uncle Joe fleeced us for everything he could possibly get. Half the world was communist as a result of FDR and his stupidity when the war ended. So, this notion of, I get along with so-and-so, he's really a good guy, forget it. It's irrelevant. But the interests are real. They have an interest, and so do we, in getting along and putting an end to this.
See if they could put something together moving forward and, hopefully get this conflict. Like you said, the only thing that's happening right now is millions of lives lost, trillions of dollars wasted. And at the end of the day, it's going to be China that's rebuilding the whole region, and we're all going to be sitting there, holding our cluster munitions in our hands, if you know what I mean. Colonel, this has been awesome.
I like that. I'm going to remember that. Holding our cluster munitions in hand sounds like we're holding something else, too. However small and insignificant they may be at the moment in the White House.
Oh, that's it. Colonel, we're going to live link your latest op-ed and your website in the show description today. For anyone that's not following you on social media, want to check you out, you got anywhere else we could live link?
Oh, no, listen, you guys do a great job. I appreciate it. I mean, YouTube, there are all sorts of various people that are putting up my material. And folks, I think we're going to win this fight. I do. And I believe that next year could be a big turning point and rescue this nation from the ash heap of history. But I'm just trying to point out this election issue. It hasn't gone away and it hasn't been fixed. Mm-hmm.